Blackjack, a Black Ocean Stowaway short story, written by J.S. Morin, narrated by Michael Naramore. The transport from the Delos recruitment station to the flight school on Camaris 5 was commercial, not military. Brad Ramsey's haircut was also of civilian origin, purchased on the cheap before enlisting, pre-med Earth-Navy regulations as a show that he was serious about joining up. The rush of wind as the boarding ramp lowered felt warm and refreshing on his unprotected scalp. "Can't believe we're doing this!" Ricardo exclaimed. He and Brad had met up on Delos to take the intake exams together, even though it would have been more convenient for his friend to take them on Vega 9, which boasted recruitment centers in half the planet's shopping malls. "We stick together," Brad warned, tempering his friend's enthusiasm. He shifted his backpack of personal effects and joined the herd descending to the starport's landing yard. Few of the passengers were recruits. Cadets, he amended hastily. This was a general transport between two podunk planets that couldn't fill an entire Earth-Navy shuttle with fresh meat for the war effort. But there was an open-air hover waiting with a low-ranking Earth-Navy spaceman to pilot them. He checked their names off a list, then prodded them aboard. "You stationed here long?" Brad asked jovially, always eager to make a good impression on the building blocks of an organization. "3 months. Already seen 2 classes matriculate," their pilot answered like this was an inquest. For the time being, he outranked them mainly by the fact that cadet was almost a non-rank. But the instant they finished flight school, they'd outrank the shit out of him. As far as Brad was concerned, this was a loophole in the whole chain of command. Proper officers essentially went to college with Earth-Navy, learning tactics and military operations alongside mathematics, classics, and history. Pilots got 6 weeks of flight school and headed to the front lines as lieutenants, scamming his way to the top before he even started. That was the pitch that had gotten Ricardo to join him, not that his friend seemed the least reluctant. "Can't wait to see you smoke the leaderboards here, too," Ricardo whispered to him. "Just remember, I'm nobody's wingman." Brad bobbed his head in silent assent. Privately, he wondered whether Ricardo was good enough to be his wingman. A 91 on the flight assessment wouldn't have gotten Ricardo into the program in peacetime. Brad's 99 was merely a function of the test not acknowledging that a 100 was possible. Squadrons would be fighting over him in 6 weeks. The hover zoomed through a brief stretch of sparse cityscape before jetting into the planet's badlands and toward a speck in the distance. Flight School 0942. "So much for 2 of us getting singles." That was the greeting Brad and Ricardo received upon entering the cadets' barracks. 8 sets of bunk beds and 16 footlockers were the only furnishings in the warehouse-style quarters. Everything was bland shades of gray except the blankets, which were a dark Earth-Navy blue. Ricardo stepped forward, introducing himself to anyone who took him up on the offer of a handshake. Brad did likewise, but ran into a roadblock with a brick wall of a cadet. "Ramsey. Brad Ramsey." The handshake paused with Brad caught in its grip. "Fairbanks. Brad Fairbanks." "Can't have 2 Brads," someone commented. "Yeah, this guy's Brad number 2. Bile rose in Brad's throat. No fucking way he was going to be Brad 2. Problem was, with no social capital, he'd have a hard time arguing over maybe a couple hours seniority with this Fairbanks shit. "What about Big Brad and Little Brad?" In the split second before he recognized the voice, Brad's anger ratcheted up an additional notch. "Drew!" Brad rushed over, clasped wrists with his best friend in the galaxy, and exchanged a half hug. Drew Williams had been in the neighborhood and enlisted right here on Camaris 5. A girl with a mop of sandy brown dreadlocks interrupted with an over-caffeinated compromise.
Just call him Ramsey. It won't matter in a few days when we all get assigned call signs and start using them.
Brad extended her a handshake. Ramsey?
Charlton, Amy Charlton, technically Amy Denise Charlton. The Amy isn't short for anything. Glad to meet you.
She gave him a lippy smile. Drew took Brad aside. Two to watch out for. That quiet dude sulking over there, that's Wellington. His dad's an admiral or some shit. The other? Brad asked, grateful for the scouting report. The one who sounds like a ratatouille on Quaaludes? She aced the flight exams, too. She's your competition, top dog. Brad took another inventory of Amy Denise Charlton. Her eyes were always moving. She bit her nails, stood with her shoulders hunched. But he should have known as well as anyone that sitting in a pilot's seat changed a person. For instance, Brad became less charming. Maybe Charlton was only a basket case when she couldn't fly. Water jetted from 16 shower heads, singing a chorus of cleanliness. The stalls that separated the cadets came to roughly shoulder height, at least for Brad. It made conversation more convenient while reducing the temptations to peek. And for that, Brad was grateful. There was, frankly, nothing hotter than a girl who could fly. Sure, there were other factors which he would not be viewing thanks to the separators between stalls, but wanting to be a fighter pilot told him everything he needed to know about a woman's character. Daring, reckless, alert, dangerous. By his own reckoning, Brad had bagged well above his limit on girls for his age, and he knew a wide spectrum by this point. A perfect girl could handle a blaster, didn't go to pieces with one pointed at her, could fly anything with engines, and didn't get clingy when things ended. "Hey, who's going to earn the first call sign tomorrow?" Fairbanks asked, shouting over the drone of water. "My boy Ramsey," Drew shouted back with exaggerated slang. "Best pilot ever!" There were laughs all around. It was true, though. Brad was the best pilot most of these colonial yokels had ever seen. "Nope, going to be Charlton," Wellington announced. "I heard the Commandant talking to Earth." Ricardo, who could see over the stalls, glowered 2 rows down at the nepotism case. "Put money on that?" "No gambling on base," Fairbanks reminded them all. "Come on, for fuck's sake, there's a war on. Don't go getting expelled." For a day of naval flight training, for a flight assessment and trip from Delos, for a night catching up with old friends. Brad had been able to push aside his reason for joining Earth Navy in the first place. Cold fury chilled Brad from the inside, even as scalding water cascaded over his pink skin. He'd enlisted for a chance to kill Eyndar, to avenge Jamie, to quell the nagging voice telling him that he wasn't going to let them get away with it. And he wasn't going to let some stupid bet or fraternizing with his fellow cadets, 7 of whom fit his sexual preferences, distract him from his mission. A week later, Brad stood at attention in the Commandant's office in uniform. The spot on the left breast where his call sign belonged was conspicuously bare. "At ease," Commandant Presley ordered, barely glancing up from the computer screen in his desk. It took a conscious effort, but Brad switched stances to what Earth Navy considered ease. "Permission to speak, sir?" The Commandant locked his gaze on Brad. "Denied. Frankly, we need a little talk about the fact that you feel the need to constantly open your mouth. These may be training exercises, and you may be exceptionally skilled at the mechanics of flying, but there is a decorum to maintain in flight exercises that will and must carry over into combat situations." Brad let a breath escape through his nose without a trip over his vocal cords that it desperately wanted. He swallowed back the snarky replies that flocked to the tip of his tongue. You may be the most instinctively gifted pilot to come through these doors. I see from your intake forms that you've had extensive racing experience, and I don't want to know where in the borderlands you learned to shoot like that. But you're cocky. You're a loose cannon, and you're going to get real people killed with your flippant attitude and freelancing maneuvers. Frankly, one-on-one, you might be a match for me in my prime. And yet, if I had to field a squadron from your class today, I wouldn't want you with me. A knot formed in Brad's throat. He wasn't used to quietly taking verbal abuse from anyone. Not from pirates or syndicate thugs. Not from Mom or Dad. Maybe Jamie a little, but he'd been a kid last time they'd really talked. Even Mort didn't get to shit on him without taking return fire. But he stood and weathered this storm, trying to keep the damage from showing in his expression. Do you understand me, cadet? Yes, sir. Good. You're the last one to earn a call sign, and I'll continue withholding it until you shape up. Any questions? Can I suggest one? For once I earn it, I mean. Commandant Presley flicked a hand to shoo Brad away from him. Get out of my office! The mess hall had mostly cleared out by the time Brad received his egoectomy. Brad reached the chow line just as the kitchen staff were pulling the tubs from under the sneeze guards. Hastily, he slopped ladles of mashed potatoes, indeterminate vegetables, and runny mac and cheese onto a tray and found himself a seat. While several base personnel were lingering over their meals, there was only one cadet remaining. Brad slid onto a bench across the trestle table from Charlton, or Scarecrow as she'd been dubbed. He smirked. Fast talker, slow eater? Scarecrow picked at her food.
Not so much that. Feeling it, you know?
It was the most subdued he'd seen the front-runner, who'd outclassed Brad in everything but actual piloting, where she was a frighteningly close second, and making friends. It was Brad who'd smuggled playing cards into the barracks for poker games with candy as stakes. It was Brad who'd learned everyone's names by the first night. Brad who'd clowned his way into the instructor's crosshairs when someone else fucked up. Scarecrow had been a weird holdout, and he saw a prime opportunity to get to know her. Oh, feeling what? He asked through a mouthful of mashed potatoes flavored with nothing but artificial butter substitute.
The wait. We're here to fight a war. Wasn't really why I signed up, not that I didn't know, but I was more running from than to, if you know what I mean.
You never said where you're from.
Earth.
Brad snickered. A long way out of the Corps just to enlist. You could have shouted from your doorstep and they'd have had a hover idling out in front of your house in minutes. Scarecrow pushed a pea around her tray like she was mini-golfing.
Haven't been there in a couple years.
Ah, gotcha. Family moves around a lot? Finally, some common ground. If anyone could relate to the nomad lifestyle, it was a Ramsey.
Nope. Mom's still on Earth.
She shot him a sidelong glance, the kind that was checking for a reaction, not looking to be noticed. Oh, now I really gotcha.
Really? Do you?
She looked up, and those lopsided dreadlocks, left over from an expected haircut that had never come, flounced to one side. Made your own way. I considered it. My sister made me promise to stay until I was old enough.
You've told the story.
Brad cleared his throat and shoved more mashed potatoes into his mouth. Right. Sorry.
Hey, before you got here, the others were all planning a trip to Slot Palace tomorrow night.
A light flicked on in Brad's head. It was the first break in their training schedule. an opportunity to get off base for an evening of unsupervised hedonism. When Brad's only reaction was to grin, she babbled onward.
Seeing as gambling was never really my thing.
"Don't worry about it," he assured her. "I've gambled plenty of places. Hell, Vegas got his call sign from growing up on Vega 9. I've done the casino where his mom worked for the syndicates. I've played poker with pirates. I think they've got a racing book, and I've always been pretty keen at spotting a winner. You can just—"
I was thinking maybe doing something else.
She looked up at him with this. Brad couldn't even do justice to the expression on her face. It was utterly baffling. A whole acting class couldn't have replicated it. Brad set down his spork and held up his hands for emphasis. "Look, it's a big deal to do what everyone else is doing. This is team building. They don't let us off the chain to scatter like ions in a nebula. They're hoping we go knocking around together."
They think I'm weird.
"You are," Brad shrugged. "Nothing wrong with that. All the best people are. You fly like a demon, and someday those scrubs are going to be climbing over one another to be your wingman. You just gotta meet 'em halfway on some stuff."
Stuff like hanging out at a casino instead of just snagging 2 tickets to a holo?
Brad bobbed his head. "Exactly. Don't worry. Stick with me, and I'll make sure you get through this cadets' night out." Scarecrow took a shuddering breath and forced a grin.
Deal.
The next day, after training and a shower, Brad tidied up his cadet uniform and sweet-talked his way past the Commandant's secretary to see the big guy. He saluted as he entered the office. "Cadet?" Commandant Presley greeted him. The man was a stone. Brad had no read on him at all. "Sir, I completed all of today's exercises without extraneous comm chatter." "Cadet Ramsey, do you feel that your instructors don't provide me with adequate reports on the progress of everyone in the program?" "No, sir." He wasn't sure just what he'd said no to, given what Uncle Mort had always described as a fundamentally flawed linguistic formatting, but he damn well had the impression that the right answer there was a no. "Do you feel like you deserve some special accolades for managing to do what most of your class knew just from common sense before even arriving here?" This was at least an easy one to puzzle out. No hidden meanings or unintended double negatives. "No, sir." "Then why are you in my office telling me things I already know on a subject you should already know?" The Commandant laced his fingers atop his desk and waited. He was expecting some kind of answer. Well, if the Commandant meant to be intentionally dense, Brad would spell it out for him. "Sir, you made it clear the last time I was in this office that you were withholding my call sign until I showed I could straighten up my act. And you presume to think that a single day's training entitles you to a call sign?" This was where growing up with a wizard came in handy. Commandant Presley had walked into an orator's trap, accepting an apparent premise that hid another. This gave Brad the opening he was looking for. "Not at all, sir. But I feel that I've demonstrated that I will eventually earn one, and would like to suggest one." That stone face almost showed a smirk. Or it could have been just a bit of food working loose behind that cheek. "What did you have in mind?" "Maverick," Brad stated without hesitation. "There's a decade-long wait list for that one." Brad deflated, but quickly rallied. "Merlin?" "Convocation nixed that one ages ago." "Devastator?" "That's a capital ship missile. Can't be anything that might be used in operational comms." "Cobra?" "Taken." "You didn't even look." While the Commandant had been humoring him to this point, a faint scowl settled over his brow. "Are you contradicting me, cadet?" "No, sir. Sorry, sir. What about Apocalypse?" "Cadet Ramsey, You seem to fundamentally misunderstand the process whereby cadets are assigned their call signs. You choose them. True, but more importantly, the cadets themselves don't. I get suggestions from instructors, fellow cadets, even the staff on base. But I never lend serious consideration to a cadet's preferences. It's tradition.
But what about Vegas?
That drew a genuine chuckle from the crusty old bastard. Your fellow cadets started calling Cadet Bassett that the first day of training. Sometimes a kid from Vega 9 just gets lucky. The 3-week mourning period for the former holder of that call sign just expired. Brad opened his mouth but didn't get a word out. And I know your next scheme. If you have your friends feed me suggestions on your behalf, I've got an extra special call sign held back for a cadet that really flushes his fuel lines. Speaking of fuel lines, your mechanics qualifier is tomorrow and you're bottom of the class. You manage to pass that, and maybe I'll assign you a call sign. Dismissed. Brad saluted. Thank you, sir. Then he blew ions before he said anything else he might regret. The transport chewed up the air and kicked up a cloud of dust that expanded in their wake. Packed in like raisins, Brad sat in the middle of the rear row between Drew, a.k.a. Dynamo, and Scarecrow. From the row just ahead of them, Ricardo, now going by Vegas, twisted around and shouted over the wind. "Aren't you worried about the mechanics qual tomorrow?" Dynamo waved off the notion. "You haven't known Ramsey as long as I have. He's either got something cooked up or he'll think of something." Then he dropped his voice. "I'm assuming, right? You're not going to wash out from the top spot just because of some technical test." Brad wasn't the studying type. He was a born improviser. The problem was that the innards of a Typhoon II trainer were a little tough to fast talk. They were insistent about how Thingamajig A plugged into Whozamadoozy B. They liked particular wrench sizes and grades of lubricant. Frankly, mechanical systems were whiny little punks. "Yeah, no worries. It might not be pretty, but I'll be out there blowing up aliens with the rest of you fly kids with your fancy new call signs." Scarecrow spoke up, as much as she ever did, still barely audible over the din.
I know we'll be out late, but if you want some last-minute cramming when we get back, I'm pretty good with my hands.
"I imagine you would be," Brad agreed. 2 years star-hopping, you must have had to learn this kind of stuff. But you guys don't need to worry about me. I won't let you all down. The Camarus 5 starport rose on the horizon as the sun set behind them. While nothing impressive by Corps standards, the glint off the 20- and 30-story skyscrapers still looked pretty and enticing. What drew all the cadets' eyes was the green glittering glass of the Slot Palace Casino. Brad needed to unwind. That was his problem. Loosen up and the mechanical stuff would come easy, he hoped, because he had no other plan. Brad had arrived on Camarus 5 with a modest nest egg. Everything he'd managed to stash out of Chuck's sight, safeguard against Mom's kleptomania, and avoid blowing on Michelle and Ree for stuff their parents wouldn't provide, now nestled in high-denomination hardcoin in Brad's pockets. Drinks were comped for cadets in uniform. Complimentary gaming tokens evaporated in an instant. The cadets scattered in clusters. Some wanted to shoot craps. A few wanted to play slot machines. Brad settled in at a blackjack table alongside Dynamo, Vegas, and Scarecrow. "That all you're betting?" Dynamo teased as Vegas plunked down a minimum bet. "Hey, this is just expensive fun. Games are all tilted to the house." Brad clapped Vegas on the back. "And this guy ought to know. He lived above one of these places.
This is the one called 21, right?
Scarecrow asked. A question like that only came from novices and hustlers. If Scarecrow was the latter, Brad would eat the wings pinned to his uniform collar. Yeah, same game. I've got a foolproof system. If you can pull it off, there's no stopping you. Oh, really? Vegas asked with a grin. Yep. What's that? Luck. You pull it off, it's unstoppable. Hit me! Brad was showing a 5 and a 6, so the 10 coming up hardly counted as relying on luck, but it still set the tone for the evening. Replacement drinks came as soon as one ran out. Chips slid back and forth from players to dealer, so much prettier than the hard coin they represented. Cadets laughed and joked, bantered with the dealer. At his side, Scarecrow unbuttoned her shirt and took it off, leaving just an undershirt and bra, damp with sweat and clinging to her.
So hot in here.
You can say that again, Dynamo agreed, sizing up an attractive pit boss.
Gonna grab a little air,
Scarecrow informed them.
Watch my chips?
Sure, Brad agreed reflexively. After that, he slugged back a martini. Then things got a little hazy. Brad awoke in the barracks, face mashed into a drool-soaked pillow. All around him, the other cadets were rushing through their morning routines. Most of the other beds were already made. He ached all over, and the sunlight through the grimy windows seared his eyes. Hangover. Casino? Yeah. Oof. He hadn't gone that hard in a while. Something about not having to explain himself to Mom or Dad or Mort really undercut any sense of externally imposed restraint. Haul ass, Ramsey. Qual is at 0700. Dynamo clapped him on the shoulder with pep only available to those with a liver like an industrial waste reclaim filter. Sitting up and blinking to clear his head, Brad grumbled, No such thing as 0700. Vegas came over and physically dragged Brad to his feet. He was still wearing boots. Breakfast shoveled itself into his mouth, under seasoned scrambled eggs and bacon that was mostly grease. A herd marched, for a loose definition, down to the hangar and floated Brad along in their midst. Finding his typhoon trainer was no trick. Brad's feet knew the way, and if that hadn't worked, it was the one no one else was stopping at. Good morning, cadets, Chief Kubrick bellowed. Today, I will be administering the Earth Navy General Starfighter Maintenance Qualification. If you expect to graduate the program, you will know the basics of the advanced combat vehicles you are privileged to operate. Each of your Typhoons has been rendered inoperable or unsafe for combat duty. You have 1 hour to find and correct the problem. At the end of that hour, or when you finish your repairs, you will stand at attention beside your vehicle while I decide whether you pass or fail. Any questions? Brad had a ton. Why did fighter pilots need to know this stuff when you couldn't walk 10 meters aboard a Navy vessel without tripping over a mechanic? Was there a way to opt out if he promised to shoot down a certain number of Eyndar? Was there any amount of money Brad could exchange for a passing grade? He said nothing. So did the rest of the cadets. Your hour starts now! Begin! Brad dug through his kit and used the multi-tool to open the engine compartment of his Typhoon. First, he searched the inside for loose components at the bottom of the hull that might give a clue to what had been sabotaged. When that didn't pan out, he poked and tugged for anything loose, but nothing turned up after a fairly thorough search.
Psst,
came a whisper from under the hull.
You okay over there?
Brad first checked that Chief Kubrick was on the far side of the hangar as he proctored the exam. Then he peeked underneath and confirmed it was Scarecrow asking. "No, not really. My brain is mush and this engine looks fine to me."
"Hand scanner, check for leaks."
That was a solid plan. He followed her advice and checked, but the scanner wasn't showing anything. "No dice."
"Well, that was what was wrong with mine. It didn't hurt to check, but you're going to run out of time. On the count of 3, drop down and roll to my side."
"What?" "Sir, may I use the washroom?" Dynamo shouted the question, drawing Chief Kubrick's attention. Scarecrow barrel-rolled up to Brad's feet and dragged him down to a kneeling position.
"Go, switch with me. Kubrick only does the qual. He doesn't know whose is whose."
She flashed a few tactical hand signs that Brad's hangover wasn't parsing. "Sir, I don't think my kit included a plasma torch," Vegas called out, waving a hand to summon the proctor. Scarecrow gave Brad a shove, and under he went. He spent the rest of the qualification puzzling over the innards of Scarecrow's engine. After all, people might buy him struggling through the test, but no one was going to believe he was among the first to finish. Brad stood at attention when the time ran out. Chief Kubrick gave his work a nod. "Nice work, cadet. If you wash out of flight school, you'll make a decent mechanic." Once the whole class had passed, they filed out for morning fitness drills. In the changing room, Brad found Dynamo and Vegas. "Thanks, guys. Saved my ass." "Least we could do," Dynamo replied with a friendly punch to Brad's shoulder. Vegas did likewise from the other side. "Especially after last night." "That bad?" Brad cringed. He hadn't noticed much in his pockets when he finally thought about his bankroll. "Bad? Don't you remember?" Dynamo asked, incredulous. Vegas was naked as he searched his locker for fitness gear. "Seriously, man, hold your liquor." "What'd I do?" Dynamo barked a laugh. "4 guys tried to get Scarecrow into a hover. She was out of uniform and drunk. She'd been gone from the table for a while, so you headed out to check on her. You went at those assholes like a rabid Wolverine." Brad perked up. "Did I win?" All the guys in the changing room overheard, and a chorus of laughter ensued. "No," Vegas informed him, "but we got there before they killed you, and Dynamo barely fits into a cockpit and is 90% muscle." Dynamo ruffled Brad's hair, or would have if it had been long enough to muss. "Helping you pass that bullshit qual was the least we could do." He'd said it openly. Everyone heard him, or at least everyone in the men's changing room. Brad glanced around. Open secret? Wellington, who'd hardly said a word to Brad since they'd arrived at flight school, summed it up. "We got your back, Ramsey, 'cause we know you got ours." The Commandant had wanted to see him this time. Given all that had transpired since yesterday, Brad didn't know what to make of the summons. He arrived freshly showered and clean-shaven. His first sign of trouble was the instruction he received as soon as he entered the office. "Shut the door." Brad complied smartly. While a few of the more core world cadets hadn't been too familiar with old-fashioned doors, he'd operated enough knob and hinge units in his time. He then drew himself up to stand at attention to receive whatever news was coming. "I have been made aware of an incident at the casino last night. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Ramsey?" "No, sir." Better to keep his answers minimal. No point trying to dig his way out of a hole until he knew which way was up. "It has come to my attention that you lost all your money at the Blackjack tables." Brad stiffened. Was that what this was all about? "Sir?" "Cadet, soon you are going to be entrusted with an armed and shielded Earth Navy Typhoon in live fire situations against hostile targets. It shows poor judgment to gamble intemperately. Leave from base is meant to allow personnel to relieve stress and recharge for continued service in peak form. It is not an excuse to wallow in hedonism to the point of personal disgrace. Is that understood?
Yes, sir. Crystal clear, sir.
Good. Because I'm also not an idiot. Sir? Commandant Presley rose and came around his desk, walking behind Brad as he stood like a statue, not daring to turn his head. I have connections with Camarus civilian police, and there are cameras in the maintenance hangar. I know you were involved in a fight outside the slot palace last night.
Sir, if I can just...
And I am aware that the police consider the matter closed. Considering Cadet Charlton's near abduction and your role in preventing it, I would let the matter settle as well.
Thank you, sir. You won't...
But I also saw the clownish hijinks during the mechanics qualification this morning. Commandant Presley circled back around in front of Brad, close enough that Brad could tell the guy drank too much coffee. Let me make myself perfectly clear. In peacetime, I would have my boots so far up your ass you'd be shitting shoelaces for a year. But we're at war, cadet. Before you can blink, you're going to be out there in it. I can choose to expel 4 cadets, including my top 2 of this class, and explain to certain admirals why I'm only sending 12 out to the squadrons. Brad dared get his hopes up. This was sounding like the bureaucracy working in his favor for once. Or I can sign off the qualification as is. Brad puffed his chest.
You won't regret it, sir.
I already regret it. But Ramsey, you have a gift that doesn't come along often, and I don't mean your hot dog flying skills. You inspire those around you. Clean up your act, and you can go far in Earth Navy. Promotions come hard and fast in the Starfighter Corps. You could be up for a command position within 5 years. Brad gulped. He knew all too well the perils of this niche in the service. Jamie had nearly killed herself working her way out of security and into the squadrons, and that promotion had gotten her killed. I see it on your face. You're thinking. Good. Nice to know you're not all piss and vinegar. Maybe you'll live long enough to make use of all that talent you seem determined to waste.
I hope to, sir.
One last item to take care of. Brad would have held his tongue with both hands if he could, but still managed to remain silent. To make sure you never forget this lesson, you're getting a little reminder, thanks to several of your fellow cadets who made the suggestion. You are hereby assigned the call sign, Blackjack. Blackjack grinned despite his hangover as he entered the mess hall for lunch. Rather than find himself at the tail end of the meal, rushing to join his fellow cadets before they all dumped their trays and got ready for afternoon classes, he walked into an ambush. Blackjack! Everyone was there. It was a birthday party atmosphere. Vegas and Dynamo had even pillaged his deck of cards to present ace-king combos as props, waving them in his face as if he didn't get the joke. Overwhelmed at the unexpected display, Blackjack accepted back pats and hugs and fist bumps and shouted claims of having arranged this or that, or convinced Presley to give him the call sign, or paid off casino security, or wheedled Camarus PD, or claiming they'd have done the same in his place, or telling him what an idiot he was or how stupid he looked trying to fight 4 guys while he could barely stand. Soaking it all in, They piled through the chow line and bragged how they were each single-handedly going to swing the Third Eyndar War for Argo. There were still weeks to go before graduation. Until he got the call sign, Blackjack somehow worried that it would fall apart on him. Backup plans of racing, smuggling, and piracy seemed more realistic than his sworn vengeance to pay back the Eyndar for starting this war, for killing his sister, for driving that knife into his heart and snapping off the blade. He loved Michelle and Ree, but they were kids. Grudgingly, he loved Mom and Dad, even though she was utterly useless and he was a disgrace. He definitely didn't like either of them. Mort had been a better father the past 6 years than Dad had ever been. But Jamie had been the closest Brad ever came to having an actual mother. Jamie had taught him to read, taught him to shoot, taught him to fly. She'd made sure Brad and the littles ate proper meals when Dad was gone and Mom too high to care. She'd beaten up bullies and taken them to med stations when they got hurt. She'd hidden Brad from colonial school officials and police. "You okay, man?" Dynamo asked. "You got all quiet. You're never quiet." Blinking back from his daydream, Brad Ramsey nodded. "Yeah, just feels real now. We're going out there, all of us. And I tell you one thing for goddamn sure." They hung on his next words like the disciples of a prophet. The Eyndar are going to fear the call sign Blackjack. Brad Ramsey's class graduated flight school in July 2546. Each of them was assigned to the Typhoon squadrons to backfill Earth Navy's unending need for pilots. 55% of all pilots serving in the Starfighter Corps didn't live to see the end of the Third Eyndar War. Theodore Wellington, callsign Dingo, never flew a Typhoon into combat. His squadron was disbanded, and the few surviving members dispersed around the fleet. Behind the scenes, high-ranking officers pulled strings, and Admiral Wellington's only son served out the war on Earth as a Navy customs inspector. He plodded through the ranks and was eventually given his own patrol ship, the Tally-Ho. Andrew Williams, callsign Dynamo, flew with distinction in Squadron 117 before a string of off-duty fistfights landed him a 3-month stint in an Earth Navy brig on Luna. He was later recruited into Squadron 333 by its new commander, Blackjack Ramsey. Dynamo died in the Battle of Carthage. Ricardo Bassett, callsign Vegas, bounced around from squadron to squadron, repeatedly one of few survivors of disastrous battles. Squadron commanders began to consider that his luck might have been cowardice, not Blackjack Ramsey, who brought him into the newly formed Squadron 333. Vegas also died in the Battle of Carthage. Amy Charlton, callsign Scarecrow, became an ace on her first mission with Squadron 297. She was consistently near the top of the fleet leaderboard for kills before a series of mental breakdowns led to confinement at an Earth Navy treatment center on Mars. After her release, one squadron commander pulled every string he had to get her assigned to his squadron, then made her his wingman. Scarecrow left the service shortly after the Battle of Carthage and worked as a mercenary before settling into a spacer life and starting a family. Bradley Ramsey, callsign Blackjack, rocketed through the ranks of the Earth Navy Starfighter Corps. He developed a preternatural knack for winning unwinnable battles and surviving suicide missions. He won the admiration of everyone he ever flew with, and the grudging respect of superiors who didn't appreciate his devil-may-care attitude. His Squadron 333, known as the Half-Devils, became legends in the fleet. After a Pyrrhic victory at Carthage, he and his surviving squad mates were quietly shooed out of the service. Blackjack changed his name, became an outlaw, made his fortune, lost it, and found a crew. That crew became a family. He also finally noticed that Scarecrow had the hots for him since the day they met. The two would eventually marry and have 3 children, Jessica, Eric, and Oswald. They're hoping that at least one of them might manage to avoid becoming a criminal. Thanks for listening to this Black Ocean adventure. This mission may be over, but there's plenty more for you to enjoy. For more magical mischief in the 26th century, search Black Ocean on your favorite audiobook store or visit blackoceanmissions.com. This has been Blackjack, a Black Ocean Stowaway short story. Written by J.S. Morin. Narrated by Michael Naramore. Copyright 2023 by J.S. Morin. Production copyright 2023 by J.S. Morin.